which is that should be fine, yeah. So it'll be a different stream, I think. It'll be like a new one because I think I closed that old one. Yeah. Oh God. Sorry. So that's the one that's going. Sorry. I guess they can just get deleted. Yeah. Cool. Cool.
Good evening, everybody. I'd just like to open tonight's proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet, and in this area, that's the Yagara and the Turrbal people. I would like to pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and especially acknowledge and welcome any Indigenous Australians who are joining us here tonight. It is my pleasure to introduce Conor Jedam this evening. Conor is a casual academic from the School of Historical and Philosophical Inquiry and ambassador for the Critical Thinking Project at the University of Queensland. He completed a Bachelor of Arts with honours in philosophy in 2025. His thesis explores the connections between the utopian impulse, prolepsis, hope, fear, agency, and Indigenous temporalities to explain how the practice of imagining and telling stories about dystopian futures allows for ethical subjectivity and political agency. His philosophical interests include feminist philosophy, environmental philosophy, aesthetics, and philosophy of fiction. Conor's other philosophical activities include reviewing the latest edition of Exordium, UQ's Student Philosophy e-journal, and presenting at the 2025 ASCP conference at the University of Melbourne. It is now my pleasure to invite him to present his paper, The Worst Is Yet to Come, How the Dystopian Imaginary Enables Ethical Subjectivity and Political Agency.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming along. It's very, very nice to see you all here. And thanks to the Queensland School of Continental Philosophy for having me as well. I'd like to second the acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge the Jagera and Turrbal peoples as the traditional owners of Meanjin, where we are today. Pay my respects to their ancestors and descendants. Recognize their cultural and spiritual connections to country. And their contributions to local and global society. This work is partially inspired by some of that knowledge, so it's very important that I acknowledge it. So, of course, First Nation sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Secondly, as this talk is an attempt to capture some of the key points from my honours thesis, I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Aurelia Armstrong, who was my supervisor. These ideas couldn't have taken shape without her guidance and support. So yeah, there she is. Okay, so in this talk, I'm attempting to provide an answer to this question. How does imagining the future, particularly in the form of dystopian cinema, promote ethical subjectivity and political agency? My aim this evening is to sketch enough of the theory so that in the first half, so that in the second half we can look at two cinematic case studies. And so to that end, I will make some brief remarks about the focus on cinema specifically and the idea of utopia. And then I'll give some more brief remarks about prolepsis, what I mean by prolepsis in this context, and then some relevant concepts stemming from Indigenous ethical relations across time, particularly the notion of spiraling time, and then we'll get into the case studies. It's about half-half. All right, so why cinema? First, because of all the forms of future-directed storytelling, it is culturally dominant, collaboratively produced, communally shared and broadly accessible. And secondly, because cinema is an aesthetic medium with which we have ethical encounters. And here, Robert Sinnerbrink's work gives structure to my account. So, for Sinnerbrink, I'm quoting, "Cinema is a medium of ethical experience with a capacity not only to enhance our grasps of philosophical approaches to ethics and to exercise capacity for moral perception and ethical understanding, but to provoke philosophical thinking through experiential, which is to say aesthetic and cinematic means." He goes on, "It can expose us to morally confronting, ethically estranging, and emotionally challenging forms of experience that demand some kind of philosophical response on our part." And I'll spend a bit more time here. So for Sinnerbrink, these ethical encounters with cinema take three different forms. First, ethics in cinema. This is what describes the moral content of the film narrative. And he associates this with the shared cinematic experience of engaging, with the perspectives, responses, actions, or experiences of others. Here he means fictional characters, depicted in complex interpersonal, social, or political situations, or ethically challenging cinematic worlds. And then the second type, ethics of cinematic representation, he calls that. This refers to the concerns raised by a film's production or reception, and entails responses to the cinema where viewers are moved to reflect ethically on what they are viewing through their experience of emotional engagement, moral sympathy, or critical reflection. And then the third type, ethics of cinema as a cultural medium, and this expresses moral beliefs, social values, or ideology. So, according to Sinnerbrink, when these three ethical aspects employ the aesthetic languages, tools, and techniques of cinema, they can provide an effectively rich, emotionally intense, and immersive experience. And taken together, these aspects issue the viewer an aesthetic invitation to ethical engagement. So similarly, by engaging with our fears about possible futures and the potential threats our actions today might pose in the future, and this is where I come in, dystopian cinema not only makes for engaging in entertainment, but involves us in the process of reflecting upon our ethical relationship to the world. It demands us to ask questions about why a fictional future seems plausible given our present, what can be done to realize or mitigate certain features of these futures, and how we might be involved in the future shaping project. In this sense, future-directed cinematic storytelling can position us in an ethical relationship to the future. Okay, so we're on to part 2 already. Brilliant. So this talk is about the dystopian imaginary, so why am I beginning with utopia? 2 reasons. First, I'm treating dystopia as a variety of the utopian, and this is in keeping with the literature in the field of utopian and future studies. And in this sense, utopia with a U up the top, this represents any imagined no place. This branches into 2 types, temporal and spatial utopias, still with a U, so these exist either in another time or a place. These then both branch into utopian, and this is with utopian with an E, and dystopian varieties, where dystopias are generally undesirable and utopias with an E are generally desirable. My focus is on temporal dystopias. This chart's a bit of an oversimplification, I think. So while utopias with an E tend to be thought of as desirable and hopeful, and dystopias tend to be characterized by their undesirability and their fearful aspects, I'm going to suggest that these categories are not wholly distinct, and that rather we can conceive of a spectrum of utopian desirability. Those worlds we find most desirable are the most utopian, with an E, and those we find least desirable are the most dystopian. And the second reason for beginning with utopia is that I take the category as inherently critical and political, following the thought of thinkers like Ernst Bloch and Frederick Jameson, who you saw on the previous slide. So for Bloch, the utopian impulse denotes a hopeful orientation towards the future that finds expression not only in utopian texts, but in human life, activity, and culture more broadly. And since the objects of our hope emerge first in our imagination, and we hope for and come to anticipate the future possibility of a different and better world, he grants imagination an importance beyond the ability to merely remember past events or fantasize about the future. Human being is characterized for Bloch by the ontological category of the not yet, which reflects the ongoing project of realizing a complete world of humanity amidst its perpetual incompleteness. So furthermore, those things to which we give imaginative form signal a criticism of the current status quo, and we make moral decisions when we decide to pursue or ignore these hopes and desires. Of course, desirable utopias in fiction have gone out of fashion, and dystopias flourished. Nonetheless, the utopian impulse continues to be expressed. Each imagined future, desirable or undesirable, speculates about the kind of world we want to live in and implicitly challenges us to imagine how, given present political realities, we might go about changing the world to make it more desirable. And this is the sincere gauntlet thrown by the utopian impulse in the guise of utopian stories. And we might understand this as the utopian challenge to power, where power is understood as seeking to consolidate and sustain hegemony in the present, and to mark the future as nothing other than the reproduction of that hegemony. And that's from Susan McManus. When we envisage better and worse futures and pose utopian challenges to power, we establish an ethical relation to the present via our imagination of the future. Part 3. Is everybody still awake? Good. Okay, so I want to unpack that idea that I left part 2 on a little bit further with the idea of prolepsis. Prolepsis, in the general sense, is the evocation of a future event. For me, it is essential because it structures the temporal and ontological relationship between the world of the imaginer and the world which is imagined. These relationships give utopian stories their distinctive ability to motivate ethical questioning. By disrupting our everyday conception of time as strictly linear, constant, and unidirectional, and by bringing the present into dialogue with fictional futures, utopian stories can work to criticize both the present and the possibility space granted to the future by that present. The critical power of utopias and dystopias lies in positioning us to question whether we can imagine plausible futures which give us any reason to hope. And in his book about time, Mark Currie discusses the importance of an anticipatory mode of being to our humanity. Not unlike Bloch, Currie suggests that prolepsis is an ontologically significant part of our existence. And his analysis of prolepsis in its narratological, structural, and rhetorical senses offers the tools with which to interrogate the multitude of ways in which we relate to the past, present, and future when we tell stories about imagined futures. What Currie calls the anticipation of retrospection, and that's how he characterizes prolepsis, reflects how we can, from the perspective of the present, imaginatively position ourselves as the temporal inhabitants of an imagined future, thereby granting ourselves the ability to evaluate the present with reference to that imagined future. And this is both a narratological and ontological structure. In other words, prolepsis lies at the heart of how we make sense of the world through narrative, either fictional or non-fictional, as well as how we exist in the world as future-oriented beings. For Currie, prolepsis constitutes a family of related types of anticipation. And to explain these, he employs concepts from narratology. And the most important of the distinction that he's going to introduce is the distinction between the time locus of the narrated, the time locus of the narrator, and the time locus of the reader. And another way of stating this distinction is to differentiate the time during which the events of the narrative take place, the time during which the narrator is giving their narration, and the time during which the reader is situated. So first, Currie describes narratological prolepsis, which here refers to a form of anticipation which takes place within the time locus of the narrated. We might think of this as a flash forward. It's a kind of time travel in that it constitutes a disruption to the linearity of the order in which the events are revealed, but it does not subvert the causal chain of events within the narrative. but it does alter the way the reader attributes meaning to and makes sense of these events. The second class, structural prolepsis, is a form of anticipation which takes place between the time locus of the narrated and the time locus of the narrator. And it characterizes the necessarily backward-looking direction of a narrator's narration. And it's called structural because it captures the sense that either the time locus of the narrative is structurally retrospective, or it is structured in relation to the time locus of the narrator, time which will in the future be present. In the first instance, the present of the narrator is subject to depresentification, in the sense that the narrator is asking us to inhabit the present of the narrated. In the second instance, the present of the narrated is depresentified by the anticipation of the present time of narration. And for Currie, this entails that the present is structured as the object of a future memory. Okay, the third type of prolepsis. And this is called rhetorical prolepsis. And this is the form of anticipation which takes place between the time locus of the narrator and the time locus of the reader. It's most often associated with the anticipation of an objection and a preemptive response to that objection. More broadly, it's the anticipation of future and the attempt to prevent the realization of that future in the act of anticipating it. So, the claim I'm making is that imagining dystopian futures and telling stories about them is a process which allows for Currie's three forms of prolepsis to take place simultaneously. When we engage in narratives which contain temporal dystopias, the relationship between our world and the imagined world is unique. In these stories, we are prompted to consider the relationship between these worlds. We are presented with a world which bears some resemblance to our own and invited to imagine which plausible events would need to transpire in our reality to actualize the unfamiliar features of the imagined future. And here, narratological prolepsis differs from its usual application in this context because it bridges the gap between two different narratives. While in standard narratological prolepsis, the future projection is confined to the boundaries of a single narrative, narratological prolepsis in the context of dystopia works across the narrative which corresponds to our reality and the narrative which contains the dystopian story. In this understanding of prolepsis, the terms reach and extent are used to describe how temporally distant the primary narrative is from the events in prolepsis and the duration of time represented by these excursions. With these terms emerges further distinctions between external, internal, and mixed prolepses. External are those which reach to periods of time either before or after the temporal boundaries of the primary narrative. Internal are those which reach to stretches of time within these boundaries. And mixed are those which overlap, but do not exist completely inside or outside of the primary narrative. And then, additionally, the terms partial and complete denote prolepses which either do or do not meet up with either the beginning or end of the primary narrative. So, adopting this terminology, my claim is that narratological prolepsis occurs in our engagement with dystopian stories, usually as a form of partial and external prolepsis. That means our reality narrative is regarded as primary, and the fictional narrative is the temporal excursion. That is, dystopian stories tend to extend across the duration of time after the audience is present, our present, and do not usually overlap with the audience's past or present. This reach between the primary narrative and the proleptic dystopian narrative then requires the audience to speculate about how the two are related and how one could lead to the other. All right, on to structural prolepsis. So, dystopian narratives entail structural prolepsis, which foregrounds the centrality of depresentification to engaging with dystopian narratives, thereby encouraging our both retrospection and anticipation. When we're asked to inhabit an imagined future, we subject our lived present to a kind of depresentification, which grants us a new vantage point from which to assess our present. By imaginatively placing ourselves in a projected future, we are encouraged to regard the present retrospectively. We can then, from the perspective of a dystopia, see our present from a temporal distance, and measure it in relation to the time which we are imaginatively inhabiting. At the same time, by imagining a future, we begin to structure the present with anticipation. And when we take an imagined future for granted, our present is lived in an anticipatory mode of being in relation to that future. We act in the present, not for the present, but for the future. And for this reason, imagined futures have the power to influence present thoughts, feelings, and actions. In Currie's words, this performative aspect of structural prolepsis takes an excursion into the future to envisage an event which produces the present in such a way that the envisaged future actually comes about. All right. Finally, dystopian stories constitute rhetorical prolepsis in the sense that when a creator presents an imagined future, they are forming an argument for how the future ought not to play out. Dystopian futures in their presentation as dystopian are counter-arguments to those who would usher in their existence. Broadly speaking, if we regard a dystopian counter-argument as a series of conditional statements in which the antecedents are those things which need to occur between the present and the future, the imagined future, and the consequence are the foundational features of that future, and we accept the antecedents, then the dystopian world will grip us. This, in turn, will make the case for why it is imperative that we avoid these antecedents or modify them such that they no longer necessitate their consequence. All right. Part 4. Spiraling time. So now that I've described the nature of temporal and ontological disruption by imagining now that I've described the nature of the temporal and ontological disruption that imagining dystopian futures involves, I'd like further to explore the ethical dimensions of this disruption, specifically by examining indigenous temporal understandings. And here I'm interested in I'm going to limit this to Native American concepts of time that reject the Western construction of unidirectional linear time, where rather than viewing the past as dead, different stages of life continue to layer upon the present. And time is characterized as cyclical and is operating in accordance with the rhythmic patterns of nature. In this way, it is attentive to the relationships between things. People experience time by paying attention to and acting in accordance with natural cycles, like the changing of seasons, growth of plants, and life cycles of animals. So furthermore, the time of myths has an ever-present quality and is continually re-experienced through various practices like telling stories, sharing knowledge, and performing ceremonies. These practices are not merely the historical recollection of past events, but the active making present of mythic time. And here, the figure of the spiral makes sense of the way in which past, present, and future are co-implicated in nonlinear ways. And I'll quote here, this signifies the implication of individuals in human and non-human spatial and temporal networks of relations that spiral inward and outward, and thereby ground an understanding of individual self-determination and freedom. Since past and future are not placed in opposing sides of a timeline, but rather as constitutive of the returning, overlapping, folding arms of the spiral, Indigenous thinkers recognize that one's understanding as a temporal subject is found when the future is anticipated on the basis of past understanding, and the past is reopened for new possibilities by ongoing futural discoveries. Potawatomi scholar Kyle Powys Whyte describes spiraling time as the varied experiences of time that we have as participants living within narratives involving our ancestors and descendants. And this may be lived through narratives of cyclicality, reversal, dreamlike scenarios, simultaneity, counterfactuality, irregular rhythms, ironic uncyclicality, slipstream, parodies of linear pragmatism, eternality, among others. In spiraling time, one is not required to remain in the present, but is free to consider and engage with the past and future in ways precluded by clock time. Rather than time marching forward, Whyte describes spiraling time as a dialogical unfolding, which does involve a sense of forward motion while also making sense of the notion that one lives alongside future and past relatives simultaneously. For Whyte, this dialogical unfolding can involve philosophizing about how communities ought to respond to the problems that they face in the present. This philosophical process begins by considering how ancestral and future generations would interpret the situations that we find ourselves in today. In doing so, one critically reflects upon what our ancestors would believe their gifts or insights to us would be if they would be able to have a chance to analyze our current situations. And those actions we can do that may not be immediately apparent to us that coming generations would appreciate in the future. In other words, by recognizing oneself as both present descendant and future ancestor, one assumes a perspective from which to discern moral actions in relation to one's present circumstances. In this way, the relationship between past, present, and future in spiraling time allows for important philosophical and ethical dialogue across time between currently living persons, memories, and stories of past persons, and the anticipated interpretations of future persons. So hence, spiraling time gives rise to a relational ethic which considers both spatial and temporal relations. So another scholar I'm going to appeal to here is Laura Harjo, who writes of a similar Indigenous temporality when she posits futurity, which designates the enactment of theories and practices that activate our ancestors' unrealized possibilities. The act of living out the futures we wish for in the contemporary moment, and the creation of the conditions for these futures. And for Harjo, Indigenous futurity is driven by an obligation to simultaneously and imaginatively consider the interests of ancestors, contemporary relatives, and future relatives. The role of a community's lived experience and knowledge for the purpose of being able to be imaginatively engaged with one's relations across time is essential. Indigenous futurity is enabled by the preservation of a community's spaces to dream, imagine, speculate, and activate the wishes of its past, present, and future kin. And what both these thinkers describe is an imaginative and speculative process of considering and questioning without access to all information. And Whyte terms this kind of philosophizing that is enabled by spiraling time counterfactual dialogue. In other words, although it is not the case that my ancestors and descendants are here to offer their actual opinion about my current predicament, how I discern an ethical course of action is illuminated by imagining this were the case. So furthermore, counterfactual dialogue is an unlimited critical pursuit, given the multitudes of generations in both directions one might consider. This ethical and practical form of philosophizing brings together knowledge and the imagination to inform future-oriented actions. So, the reason that these Indigenous perspectives on temporality are relevant to the present discussion is that Indigenous temporalities illuminate the ethical dimensions of inhabiting temporalities precluded by clock time. The process of prolepsis prompted by dystopian cinema, in which we imagine a future, take that future as given, and recontextualize the past in light of it, thus informing how we understand and act in the present, is an exceptionally similar temporal mode to spiraling time. Here, one is not strictly contained in the present, but engaged in dialogue with past, present, and future in a way that shapes understanding and guides action in the present. By suspending our entrapment in the present, we gain access to new ethical considerations. And by employing the techniques of film, dystopian cinema has the power to encourage philosophical thinking, broaden ethical horizons, and expand moral imaginaries. In the case of spiraling time, these are the interests, concerns, and desires of our ancestors and descendants from assumed past and future temporal points in relation to our situation in the present. These are informed by knowledge, but nonetheless imaginatively constructed. In the case of prolepsis, these are the interests, concerns, and desires of the inhabitants of an imagined future from an assumed future temporal point, with which we recast our own interests, concerns, and desires to assess our goals. Likewise, the future and our collective memories are informed by knowledge, but nonetheless imaginatively constituted and subject to change. So while not the dominant temporal mode of existence in contemporary life, by engaging with imagined futures, we gain access to something significantly like spiraling time, thereby granting access to new types of critical thought, counterfactual philosophizing, and ethical relations to others across time. That's all the theory. I'll have some water. Okay. On the Beach, directed by Stanley Kramer and adapted from the 1957 novel by Neville Shute, depicts a hopeless near future, 1964 in this case, in which after a short World War III, life in the Northern Hemisphere has been eliminated by a nuclear holocaust. The fallout is steadily drifting south and expected to arrive in Melbourne in a matter of months, bringing with it radiation sickness and mass extinction. The film follows the final months of Dwight Towers, commander of the USS Sawfish, which is an American submarine, which was submerged at the time of the nuclear attacks. Moira Davison, a hedonistic and lonely alcoholic with whom Towers develops a romance. Peter Holmes, an Australian naval officer. Mary Holmes, Peter's wife. And Julian Osborne, who's a scientist who worked developing the bombs. As the film progresses, hope for survival is snuffed out. When Commander Towers, Lieutenant Commander Holmes, and the crew of the Sawfish travel to Alaska to investigate the hypothesis that radiation levels have lowered more quickly than anticipated, the tests return a higher than expected reading. Later, when they are sent to investigate a garbled Morse code transmission from San Diego, they discover the signal is merely the result of a glass bottle being raised and lowered onto a telegraph key by the pull cord of a window shade. Returning to Australia, they learn that the fallout has already reached Brisbane. Finally, in an official recognition of hopelessness, the Australian government issues suicide pills to the public so that those who remain may die peacefully rather than by succumbing to radiation sickness. And the film concludes with haunting images of an empty and lifeless Melbourne. Without prior knowledge, it only becomes apparent to the viewer that On the Beach is set in the future when the camera tracks to reveal January 1964 displayed on a calendar in the Holmes residence. And this moment is 9 minutes into the feature. The viewer has already settled into the movie, allowing them to identify it with the world presented prior to engaging with difference. At this point, proleptic engagement begins. Assuming the position of a moviegoer in 1959, prolepsis entails a reach of 5 years. The world of On the Beach is at the same time very familiar and turned upside down. Oil has become scarce as the supply came from the Northern Hemisphere, so the streets are populated by commuters traveling by bicycle, horse, or electric tram, and even the milkman has stopped delivering. The Salvation Army has begun holding meetings outside State Library under a banner that reads, "There is still time, brother," though each gathering is smaller in number. More significant, though, is that the existential catastrophe that the characters find themselves in pervades every moment and interaction, even when it goes unspoken, and provokes the characters and audience to ask, how could we let this happen? And what do we do now that it has? Ruminating on the absurdly bleak answer to the former question, Osborne, that's the scientist, states, "The war started when people accepted the idiotic principle that peace could be maintained by arranging to defend themselves with weapons they couldn't possibly use without committing suicide." Grappling with the latter, Peter asks, how do you tell a woman you love that she has to kill herself and her baby? In this sense, with narratological prolepsis, On the Beach asks the audience to consider the actions and decisions that would need to happen for this morally repugnant future to manifest. When inhabiting the future of On the Beach, thereby depresentifying the present, the audience also gain a new perspective on the lived present, as is the function of structural prolepsis. This film requires the audience to assess how their thoughts, decisions, and actions could be related to a plausible future nuclear holocaust. Since the future depicted is clearly an undesirable one, the film issues an invitation to the audience to consider how to ensure this future is avoided. And in this sense, the banner reading, "There is still time, brother," addresses the audience in ways that it does not address the characters. While the characters, even those in a state of denial, understand that their days are numbered, those in the lived present recognize that it is, at least not yet, too late. And finally, prolepsis in the rhetorical sense is clear in On the Beach. The filmmakers are advancing an argument based on the fact that the outcome of nuclear warfare, is unacceptable to the entire human race, that nuclear proliferation and the potential outcomes of the Cold War are problems of urgent and global significance. and that the underlying values which have given rise to the fears addressed in On the Beach are mistaken and must be rejected. Given this, the temporal disruption of prolepsis in the case of On the Beach is responsible for imagining a future to criticize the historical narratives which have allowed for and justified the Cold War and threaten the annihilation of life on Earth. In turn, by dismantling this collective memory and reconstructing it in a way which delegitimizes the decisions that led to the Cold War, the audience gains new ways of interpreting the present and have a moral justification for pursuing a future in which the threat of nuclear annihilation is no longer present. And this justification is, at least in part, informed by a recognition that causing the extinction of humanity would be an insult to the projects of all ancestors and a denial of the interests of all descendants. And descendants here represented by in the film by Jennifer, the Holmes infant child. In other words, On the Beach, through prolepsis, has allowed its audience to delight in the aesthetic value of cinema, while also facing morally confrontational material in a way that opens new ethical relations across time. And On the Beach is rich with ethical aspects which evoke effective responses in the audience. As Cinnabrink's Ethics in Cinema describes, the narrative content and the decisions and actions of the characters work to strengthen the film's ethical dimensions. For example, when Osborne, again that's the scientist, ends his life by carbon monoxide poisoning using his prized Ferrari, the audience is simultaneously pleased that the scientist could die on his own terms, while crushed to witness a world in which the decision is necessary. The rhetorical aspect, which advances the social values of an anti-nuclear ideology, challenges the audience, as described by the ethics of cinema as a cultural medium. And the ethics, and I think politics, of cinematic representation is captured by the choice to imagine and represent a believable and unspectacular worst-case scenario, in which the importance of fostering human connection is central. And the film was recognized for its political significance and through its expansion of audiences' ethical horizons by prolepsis, I think, motivated political agency in significant ways. So prior to the film's release, the US government understood the threat On the Beach posed to the public's perception of the US military strategy. A memo from the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations reads, "The principal impact of On the Beach on the public will be a revulsion against the use of nuclear weapons of any kind and a possible sense of defeatism with respect to the use of armed forces as an instrument of national policy." And this prediction was largely accurate. Upon the film's release, it was discussed not only by critics and cinema patrons, but by politicians, public figures, scientists, and activists who recognized the film's release constituted an event of both cinematic and political significance. Linus Pauling, who had then recently received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry and would later receive the Nobel Peace Prize, speculated, "It may be someday we can look back and say On the Beach is the picture that saved the world." And with this film, director Kramer sought to stimulate awareness and discussion about the dangers of nuclear weapons. In doing so, he intended to dismantle the military's approach to the issue, which maintained public ignorance and spread disinformation, thereby mitigating popular fears and ensuring continued support for a nuclear strategy. US Senator Richard Neuberger spoke positively of the film's political role and asserted that it should help to stir all people everywhere, in and out of government, to work fervently for peace and understanding among nations. And he claimed that the film could do more in terms of effect than the so-called peace movement can possibly hope to accomplish in many months of work. And Neuberger was right about the film's potential. It motivated filmgoers to join the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy. It was appealed to by activists and politicians alike to add force to anti-nuclear arguments, including in Congress. In retrospect, the film is considered to be the most politically efficacious of its era for raising awareness of and provoking discussion about the danger of nuclear weapons, and is recognized as likely contributing to the achievement of the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty. So, it is the case that a movie which reflects the fears of the filmmakers presents an ultimately hopeless outcome as the result of such fears and persuades the viewer to adopt and ethically engage with these fears, manage to promote politically effective agency. Okay. So, Night Raiders, directed by Danis Goulet, is set in 2043 and conjures a post-Civil War North America. A totalitarian military regime whose insignia resembles the swastika has seized control. Much of the remaining population live in dilapidated cities where government drones drop food rations. By law, all children 4 years or older must be reported to the nearest Academy Intake Bureau, where they're going to be brainwashed into allegiance to the government and trained as soldiers. This is hidden from the public by propaganda, which ensures that parents believe surrendering their children to the academy guarantees a world-class education and a brighter future. The film follows Nishka and her 11-year-old daughter, Wasis, who have successfully evaded capture and arrest by the government by living in the forest, despite the patrol of AI-powered drones. When Wasis is injured in an animal trap, she is taken to Roberta, Nishka's friend who lives in the city. This is Roberta here. On Roberta's advice, Nishka gives up Wasis to the government, knowing that she will be taken to the academy, and this is the only way to get her medically treated. 10 months later, Nishka is captured by a group of Cree. Cree here refers to a particular group of North American Indigenous people. And this group that capture Nishka are from a community made up of various Indigenous identities who have established a camp near the academy. This camp, called Kitsaki, led by Ida, have been conducting covert operations, smuggling children out of the academy and teaching them Indigenous ways of life. Ida informs Nishka of a prophecy which describes a stranger who will lead the rescued children to safety, and that Nishka could be this stranger. Meanwhile, inside the academy, Wasis, and you can tell that this is inside the academy, Wasis, now addressed as Elizabeth, is subjected to a militaristic indoctrination program. The children sleep in locked wire pens, they're taught to handle weapons and placed in competition with one another. Non-compliance is met with corporal punishment and emotional manipulation. At each drill, the children must recite the pledge. We pledge our hearts and give our allegiance to our glorious republic. We praise the great southern nation for emancipating us and solemnly swear to protect it in the name of God, our liberty and freedom. One country, one language, one flag. Nishka, dismissive of the prophecy, returns to the city and discovers that the government has unleashed a virus via the food drops. And the government are enforcing a mandatory evacuation of all citizens. She and Roberta are ushered into transport, and here Roberta recognizes a soldier as her son, Pierre, who underwent brainwashing at the academy. When Roberta attempts to reconnect with Pierre, he kills his mother, dismissing her as a freeloader. Following this, Nishka returns to Kitsaki and learns the government have begun construction of a mining road through the camp. While the community prepares to defend the land, Nishka and others break into the academy and liberate Wasis and her peers. As the community of Kitsaki and state soldiers face off, an army of drones arrive. These are government-owned drones. Nishka returns with her daughter, and Wasis communicates with the drones using ancestral knowledge, thereby gaining their allegiance. And this causes the soldiers to retreat and reveals that Wasis is the prophesied stranger. The temporal setting of Night Raiders is revealed quite subtly through diegetic public announcements, allowing the audience to be lulled into proleptic engagement throughout the opening scenes. At the time of release, which was 2021, narratological prolepsis involved a reach of 22 years. The North America of Night Raiders is in many ways identifiable, but its differences are stark and invite the audience to consider the intervening temporal span. While work on the film commenced in 2013, it extrapolates a world built from many fears that were relevant to viewers in 2021. And I think there's no doubt that the COVID-19 pandemic, the divisive rhetoric of Donald Trump's first presidency, the contentious election of Joe Biden, the January 6th attack on the US Capitol, and the rise of the far-right neo-fascist groups like the Proud Boys were fresh in the memories of audiences. In Night Raiders, the filmmakers conjure a future in which fears of fascism, white supremacy, violent political unrest, and continued ecological exploitation are taken to severe but sort of understandable conclusions. In the narratological sense, the film invites the audience to reckon with how these fears might develop in the 22-year reach, as well as how they might be mitigated. Additionally, structural prolepsis is in play in Night Raiders. By inhabiting this disturbing future and considering the dialogue between it and the present, the audience looks back to the present in a novel way. We can see that in the present, the political, ecological, and technological seeds of Night Raiders 2043 have been planted and must not continue to be nurtured if the worst outcomes are to be avoided. By following the lives of those struggling to preserve their culture and assert their sovereignty under a nationalist totalitarian regime, we gain a perspective that reveals the extent to which this future is harmful and undesirable. Moreover, the film allows for the recognition that the dominant values of a future which rejects the plurality of culture, identity, language, and so on, will lead to confronting and morally unacceptable outcomes. So the film implicitly issues an invitation to embrace solidarity, allyship, kinship, and diversity. In the rhetorical sense, Night Raiders presents an argument against ideologies which further division, whether this is division between the human and the natural, the colonizer and the colonized, or even oneself and one's ancestry, as symbolized by Pierre's violent rejection of his mother's love, and the government's attempt to turn Wessis against her heritage. Contrastingly, the success and survival of Kitsaki is due to the community's relations with ancestors and descendants. We see them consulting with elders, performing rituals, speaking in Cree, and singing together. Their mission to usher children to safety is of utmost importance because, as one member of the community tells Nishka, there's a whole way of life at stake here. In these ways, the characters exemplify the ethical relations entailed by Whyte's counterfactual philosophizing. And in addition to offering proleptic engagement with an imagined future, the temporal disruption provoked by Night Raiders looks to the future to understand anew the horrors and continued relevance of the past. As Missy Malloy writes, Goulet rewires the dystopian genre, strategically staging moments of horror to underscore plot references to historical traumas suffered by Indigenous people in Canada and elsewhere that resonate in the present and cast shadow on imagined futures, including land confiscation, colonial indoctrination, and genocide. The brainwashing of minors in the film resembles the Canadian Indian residential schooling system and serves to recreate the lived emotional experiences of the culture and people who survived. In other words, by imagining a future, Night Raiders reconstructs the past from an Indigenous perspective. And additionally, Goulet was inspired by the 2013 Idle No More movement and the 2016 protests opposing the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock Reservation. And of course, in these films, the struggles are reflected by the clash between the government and the Kitsaki community and the threat of the mining road through the camp. So in doing so, the filmmakers not only draw attention to ongoing colonial harms, but raise the importance of Indigenous solidarity and allyship in dismantling the colonial narratives which seek to obfuscate the appalling reality. In this sense, through proleptic engagement with fear, Night Raiders allows audiences to grapple with morally confronting and emotionally challenging subject matter, not only in its projected future, but also in the past and present, by employing the aesthetic language, tool, and techniques of cinema. In the words of producer Tara Woodbury, the film digs into themes of oppression and xenophobia, otherness, intergenerational trauma, and gender politics, all within a really entertaining vehicle. For Goulet, setting the film in the future offers a layer of protection without having to compromise the intensity of the film's message. So Night Raiders offers an ethically rich cinematic experience. We agonize with the characters when they face heartbreaking decisions. For example, we experience ethics in cinema when Nishka decides to leave Wasis, knowing that doing so means they will be separated until her daughter reaches adulthood, at which point she will be brainwashed. We feel Nishka's pain and Wasis's confusion. Our ethical horizons are broadened by the ethics of cinema as a cultural medium when we place the political forces of Night Raiders in dialogue with the past and present and recognize the ideological foundations that give rise to fascism, totalitarianism, and nationalism. But also, by foregrounding Indigenous characters and drawing attention to their oppression across time, Night Raiders not only conjures our moral sympathy, but invites critical reflection upon our relation to the subject matter and themes. Now, unlike On the Beach, Night Raiders was not a highly visible blockbuster, but its creation, existence, and distribution are themselves political acts, according to producer Ainsley Gardner. To portray Indigenous subjects in an imagined future is political because putting ourselves in the future means that we're still here. And colonization was meant to annihilate and forget about us, but we're still here, just. In Canada, where legislation has historically outlawed Indigenous cultural expression, Night Raiders is among a new wave of Indigenous sci-fi and horror, a mode of cultural expression which has been historically dominated by non-Indigenous storytellers. Goulet writes, people in our community have wanted access for so many years for the right to tell our stories. It's a really exciting time. The director also recognizes that telling stories from one's own marginalized perspective has the power to challenge harmful stereotypes that have proliferated through popular culture. And this authenticity is expressed not only by representation, but through language as well. While the government of Night Raiders mandates that the only legitimate language is English, a number of characters from Kitsaki speak Cree. The significance of this assertion of cultural identity transcends the narrative, and Gail Maurice, who plays Ida, the leader of the camp, says of speaking Cree that it's a living thing. It comes from the ground, it comes from the earth, and it just flows through me, and it pulses. It's not just a language, it's actually, I'm going to cry, it's like my ancestors. So by allowing for cultural expression and authentic Indigenous representation, Night Raiders not only allows for new ethical considerations and political reflections in its audiences, but has enabled the political agency of its creators in the face of ongoing oppression and future-oriented fear. So, at the start, I posed this question: how does imagining the future, particularly in the form of dystopian cinema, promote ethical subjectivity and political agency? And the answer is this: imagining the future through dystopian cinema enables ethical subjectivity and political agency through proleptic engagement with fear. When we watch dystopian cinema, we are involved with the process of prolepsis in its narratological, structural, and rhetorical senses. And this allows for the destabilisation of our ordinary temporal modes, which in turn opens new ethical perspectives and subjectivities. Furthermore, the nature of these subjectivities is described by Indigenous temporalities, which situate the thinker in ethical relation to both their descendants and ancestors, informed by both knowledge and speculation. By opening ethical considerations through dystopian cinema, the audience can consider important problems, understand their relation to future-oriented fears, and ultimately gain access to new ways to live and act as political agents. The utopian imaginary has always been political. It is an essential tool for asking the question, is this the life we really want? Not only is it easy to imagine undesirable futures, it is politically essential that we do so. At a time when it is challenging to be hopeful, we should not accept the lack of political agency. Rather, we must continue to face our fears, imagine new futures, and place ourselves in ethical relations with others, real and fictional, across time. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll probably, please leave if you have to, but we'll probably go to about 7:40. We have about 15 minutes for questions. Does anyone have any questions? Hey.
I was wondering how you would say prolepsis changes if we're watching, and if we just watch On the Beach now, like how does it change if you're watching what an older version of a future dystopia looks like?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you. I think these dates are not, they're not a rule, they're like a guide, right? I think what matters more so than the strict time in which an imagined future is set is whether we take up those, the antecedents of the argument, I guess. You know, if we can imagine, if we can put ourselves in that future and it grips us in a way that is effective and affecting, then we're going to have some kind of engagement with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking there's always something more to it if we're looking at like something like a nuclear holocaust and like it's something that's still feasible now, but it would look so different.
Yeah.
Than how we used in the past.
Yeah.
Or does that add maybe another dimension?
Yeah, it certainly does. This is an interesting, I think it's an interesting case study because it was remade in 2000 as a TV film. And so there are, and it was, at that time it was set at that time. So it was moved from 1964 to like 2001 or something. And they made updates, right? There were people who were caught up in online conspiracy theories, for example. So yeah, I guess that gives you some sense of how we might imaginatively engage with these things differently. Yeah. Yeah. Does that make, yeah, okay.
I've just got a question about, could you just talk on the difference between imagined dystopias and imagined utopias in terms of like deconstructing the present? In terms of,
Yeah, I can. So an imagined utopia with an E, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the difference really is the engagement with hope or fear. When I was doing this research, the only imagined utopia that I could think of from the last few years was that documentary. I think it was called 2030 or something, or 2063. So it was like an imagined like feasible future that was hopeful, right? And the reason I was interested in dystopias specifically was that they are associated with our fears, right? And fears tend to be associated with the disarmament of like your agency. So if you fear something, at least enough, you will be sort of rendered inert in terms of your agency. And I was like, well, I can relate to that. I can relate to being so fearful that I was so full of fear that I feel some kind of political disengagement. I thought there's got to be a way around that, right? Rather than just appealing to hope, especially when that hope is like so hard to get and so hard to make feel real, like feel like reasonable. So that's why. Yeah. Yeah.
In both of your examples, you brought up the fact that while both of these films do this job of creating new ethical subjectivities, they're also entertaining. I wondered if you have any thoughts on the relationship between discussing these quite heavy ethical subjects and entertainment or enjoyment of art. Like, are they in conflict or do they complement each other?
It's an interesting question. Look, I don't think that I don't think that we would engage with some of this material if it wasn't entertaining. And so I mean, some of us might. Some of us might go and read The Road or something particularly grim, but a lot of us aren't going to. A lot of us are going to be turned off by that, the fact that it's really hard to grapple with. And so I think, like Goulet says in this, like it's, or maybe it was the producer, but there was one of those quotes where they're saying it's a really entertaining story and we get to do this. And so the entertaining story gets you into a place where you can start doing this process of temporal destabilisation. Yeah, I don't know if that's a cop-out answer, but yeah.
So I'm very sorry if I can't
Yeah, that's all right. Me too.
So proleptic engagement with fear, you say it can be like politically incapacitating, or it can be engagement. It seems like proleptic engagement. Sorry, how was it? What's the phrase?
Yeah, proleptic engagement with fear. Yeah.
This can also be put to bad uses. It can be used
Yeah.
to promote right-wing social movements. And it also seems like it's sort of a two-part question. They are
Mm.
you single out like Indigenous temporalities as politically subversive
Mm.
and emancipatory. Dialogue with ancestors, counterfactual, engagement with the future. You can also see this in conservative ideas of tradition.
Mhm.
Like fetishizing the West, our past. And we do think about the past in terms of the future, and carrying on the tradition, legacy, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
So what is it about all of dystopias that you're describing and the Indigenous temporality that you mentioned that makes it politically subversive?
Mm. What's the difference? Yeah. I mean, yeah. I agree with you that imagining futures and doing this kind of temporal engagement can be used for any political goal. I think that's the case. Welcome back. Yeah, I completely agree with you on that point.
I'm not saying it's to be sort of provocative. I'm just
No. Yeah.
clarify what is it about these sorts of temporalities that are emancipatory?
Yeah. So the reason that the Indigenous temporality is so important is because of the because it aligns with this idea of destabilizing the sort of linear, consistent march of time. And I think maybe more conservative pictures of this are going to be something like nostalgia, where it's something more like a looking back, whereas this is like it's a spiraling sort of, and it's more maybe iterative.
It's less
Yeah.
like rigidly so.
Yeah, I think I think you're right there. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I was going to ask a very simple question. I was thinking about the propagandist
Yeah.
elements of dystopias, and I wanted to ask whether it was possible to have a dystopia that could be propaganda for oppression or propaganda for the opposite of political agency.
Yeah, I think that's the case. The thing that I'm going to push up against, though, is this sort of utopian challenge to power, like Susan McManus was talking about, where hegemony is sort of seen as the replication of itself. Systems of power are built to sort of shore themselves up and so on, and that the utopian challenge is this sort of disruptive idea. It's necessarily
Revolutionary?
at least change, right? It's a critical questioning. It's an ongoing critical questioning. Whereas if you have something that's already oppressive and already a structure of power, then I don't think you're going to see that sort of critical questioning. Yeah, maybe. I could be wrong. That statement applies to the last hour.
Any questions?
And over the course of doing this, you received a lot of movie recommendations.
Yeah.
If you're thinking now about like what you would like to see discussed in this dystopian way to create a future that is more hopeful,
Yeah.
are there any things that you already would do a good job?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have time to go into this, but I think there are a whole in the talk, I mean, I think there is a crazy host of things to be worried about and to speculate the possible outcomes of. I don't know that any particular dystopian future is going to capture all of those. I think part of what's good about storytelling is that you get so-and-so's version and, you know, another person's version. You get Indigenous perspectives. You get, you know, you get The Last of Us. You get The Hunger Games. You get The Matrix. You get all these different versions that are going to be all different versions to different people as well. And I think, I don't know if there's a particular fear. I mean, I'm particularly interested in sort of climate change and ecological destruction and so on. But that's, I think that's maybe the most pressing one. But I think the diversity of storytelling and the diversity of representations of the future is part of what makes it useful.
I guess my question was also on the choice of the medium of cinema as sort of something that you apply the framework of prolepsis and temporality to. So it seems like a lot of people, especially like they're talking about like mass media, is sort of a form of like ideological control, and it kind of makes me think when discussing like Indigenous ways of knowledge and temporality through mass media and like Hollywood blockbusters, it almost seems like you have an emancipatory knowledge being subsumed into that hegemonic system. And so I wanted to just kind of ask the question about like what was it specifically about cinema as a medium compared to other things like literature or anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, it's just one that I'm interested in and have a sort of personal bias towards. But the other thing is that I think Cinnabrink's cinematic ethics is really useful, and I really sympathize with his work more broadly. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that the Frankfurt School thing, like, I think I'm probably going to be a little bit more on the side of Benjamin here in saying that this, like, cinema is something that it's not so much anymore, but had a cultural dominance and had sort of, I like the fact that it's something that you consume in groups, historically at least, and that, I mean, part of it is that I used to work at a cinema too, right? So I would see people watch movies and come out and discuss them and go, what do you think of this? And I think that's a really valuable sort of place where discussion happens. I mean, people have book clubs, people have, you know, people watch TV shows together and all sorts. I think all those are valuable. I think all those are valuable. But yeah, personal bias and Robert Cinnabrink. Yeah.
No other questions? We'll thank Conor for his presentation.
Thank you.
Just very quickly, our next QSCP event is going to be on Thursday, the 16th of July, and that's Stevie Sampson presenting the Subjectivity and the expansion of managerial bureaucracy. And details about upcoming events are always on QSCP.net. We can also check Facebook. Thank you for coming. Have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you. I'll stop it now. Right. If I can figure out how to.